How many monthly listeners does it take to make a full-time living from Spotify streams alone? Well, the answer is about 400,000 monthly listeners, but if you want to know why, watch the rest of this video. So first, I want to walk you through those 3 example artists, and they're going to get bigger as we go along. What I've done is I've pre-compiled my thoughts and taken screenshots to organize everything and do some math, but I do have the artists pulled up here so we can see their current stats as well. And actually, I think I have an extra artist in here, so I guess you get a bonus artist along the way too. So this first artist is a pop artist of sorts. And when I took this data, they had 89,000 monthly listeners and 300,000 streams. If we assume a third of a penny per stream, which is not a number I plucked out of thin air, I actually calculated it from several royalty statements I have from multiple distributors, and that's a reasonable assessment. Moral of the story, with this amount of streams and that cost per stream, we're getting about $1,030 per month for this artist. So moseying along to example artist B, they're a little bit bigger. They had 300,000 monthly listeners, about 1.1 million streams. This artist also has a mostly tier 1 fan base, so I can go in here in location data. Mostly US, followed by Germany, Canada. These are some of the highest paying countries in Spotify. UK is also very high in Australia. And then we have Brazil and Mexico, which pay less, but they're also smaller, less represented here. So I'm also assuming a third of a penny a stream, which I think is very reasonable. That 1.23 million streams at the time translated to $4,100 per month from Spotify alone. And by the way, if you want to go and read this article, because there is more context and stuff on different things, I will link it down below. It's on my website, so you can check it out. But let's go to example artist C here, which is the biggest artist in this data pool. They're an adult contemporary artist. At the time, they had 1.4 million monthly listeners. They just dropped a song. Now they fell down to 1.25 million monthly listeners. 5.4 million streams a month now. But if you look at when I took the picture, they had 6.5. So we're using the 6.5 here. Now, however, for them, it's a little bit different. Their biggest audiences are Philippines and Indonesia, then US, but then Indonesia. So Philippines pays very, very, very low on Spotify compared to like all the other countries we've been talking about so far. Same with Indonesia. But US is their number 2, and Canada is the number 4, and Australia is number 5. So they do have a lot of higher paying tier 1 countries in their top 10, but they do have some of the lowest paying countries in their top 10 as well. So for this, what I did is I assumed 2/10 of a penny, or rather 1/5 of a penny instead of 1/3 of a penny. So, more streams, way more streams, but reduced royalty rate, and that comes to $13,000 a month, assuming that 6.5 million streams a month. Now, to make this easier, I made a table, because tables make life better. And so essentially we have $1,000, the first artist, $4,000, and then $13,000 for the third artist. This is the example breakdown of all 3 of those artists at the time. And so then it just becomes a question of, well, 1, how much do you need to live off of? And then 2, how many monthly listeners is that? Because it's going to depend a lot, right? If you live in the US, there's essentially no chance that this would ever be livable, as far as I know. Depending on where you live in the US, this $4,000 a month very well may not be close to being livable. It just depends where you live. If you live in the Midwest, it's probably great, but if you live in California, New York, even Massachusetts, it's probably not going to be enough unless you're living and sharing with roommates and stuff like that, and you have very low bills. So I think for some people, this starts to be the threshold where it's like, okay, like this is a serious thing, and then with the other thing we're going to talk about later, it's going to actually make it more livable. Now, example artist C, I think almost everyone would agree, this is definitively a livable monthly wage, right? If you're making this much money per month from your streaming, multiply that by 12, so it's like $150,000 a year. That's what like software engineers and I don't know what lawyers and doctors make, but it's probably like, mid-level software engineer, higher level like mechanical, electrical engineer, lower level doctor, lawyer. At least in America, it's different in every country, but definitely livable depending on location. Definitely not livable is what I would call this. Now, I want to harp on this table for a little bit because there's some additional context that kind of changes everything. Artist 1 does work with labels for their releases, and they also have a distribution deal that also takes a cut, and they also have management, which also takes a cut. So this 1,030, it doesn't all make it to the artist. But remember, that's not the whole story. That's not everything they make. They also have Apple Music, they also have iTunes, they also have Pandora, they also have Amazon, and then of course they also have merch, and they also have shows, and they also have I don't know if they have a Patreon, but they could have a Patreon. We're going to get into this as we go to these next tiers, because this second artist, they're not with the label, They have been in the past. So some of their catalog might be tied with some of that label, meaning some of their catalog they might not be making 100% of. They're a band. And as far as I know, a lot of their stuff gets split at least 2 ways, but sometimes 3 ways, depending on the individual song. So they immediately cut this in half, divide this by 3 kind of a thing. Now, for them, though, they tour every year. And that's kind of the bread and butter of how they make a lot of their income. But they also do merch, and they also have all the other streaming platforms, and they also sell VIP tickets to their shows, and they might have a Patreon, right? They have all these other things that collect, and they actually are a full-time artist. All the band members do the band full-time, essentially. They have other music things they do other than just the band, but they're full-time making a living in the music industry, and their band is a big chunk of it. It's not the entire chunk, but it's a big chunk. Next one, also a full-time artist who's had a thriving long-term career. This number also gets drastically cut. He's been on multiple labels. He has different deals with different things. However, super good touring presence. And he also has all the other things you'd expect. He has merch, and he has different streaming platforms. In fact, Spotify, for example, artist C, is actually one of his smallest platforms. He does way better on Pandora, Amazon, Apple Music, iTunes, etc. than Spotify. Just he has an older fan base, essentially. On one hand, this number gets shrunken a lot because of his historical deals. He's been an artist for a long time, so some of those deals are what the old industry was like very bad deals for artists. So you can kind of see how this number in some ways is a lot bigger than what is explained here, but in other ways it's smaller. And really that's the case for all of these artists. This first one does pretty good with sync licensing. This last one also, I believe, has some sync licensing. So, one of those things alone can make your music career work, right? If you make almost nothing from streaming, but you get the right sync placement and the right TV show or film, you might be able to live off of that alone, right? So that's what these numbers don't tell. Now we can go into how many monthly listeners does it actually take, and how did I come to that conclusion? All right, so we have to get our assumptions into the mix. First, we're assuming that you're only making money from Spotify and you're not making money from any of the sources that we've talked about thus far. It's just Spotify, which you shouldn't make your goal, but if that's your goal, this is what we're going to be calculating. The next thing we have to figure out is where do you live? Because where you live is going to drastically influence what defines making a living. If you live in the middle of the United States versus living in Los Angeles, and I looked it up online, and apparently in 2025, you need about $64,000 a year to cover your cost of living. That's what the internet says. It makes sense to me. Massachusetts is a fairly expensive state to live in. I look at how much my mortgage cost, and I was like, okay, that checks out. That makes sense. Keep in mind, this is household. So if you have multiple people, you can contribute to that, and you can kind of divide this in half, etc. But $64,000. So we're going to assume $64,000. Now we're assuming a third of a penny is the stream rate. So we're going to do 0.00333. So now we can just do some math, right? If we were to say we want to make this much money, but we're going to divide that by the pay per stream, and then so if we have how much money we need divided by pay per stream, we divide those out, we're going to get streams as the answer. If you're not comfortable with math, just take my word for it. I am fairly comfortable with math. And let's make this look a little bit better with commas so it's easier to read, and we don't want decimals because you can't have partial streams. So this gets us 19.2 million streams. So this is streams required. So if you want to make a full-time living in Massachusetts with just Spotify alone as a single person, you need $64,000 a year, third of a penny, that's 19.2 million streams per year. So we can do this is that 19 divided by 12. This will give us a monthly amount of streams. I'll convert that to a number as well. And 1.6 million streams per month. And that also exactly matches up with the math I did before this video, so I can check my answers. How many streams on average do you get per listener? Because that's going to get us our monthly listeners. Well, we can look at these different artists and we can get some examples. So 3.8 for this one, 3.1 for this one, 3.6 for this one, and 4.3 for that one. So what I wrote down before this is that most artists have a stream per listener between 3 and 6. All of these were between 3 and 5, or really 3 and 4.5. So what I did is I assumed 4 streams per listener, which I think based on these artists you would agree with is a reasonable assumption. 4.3, 3.6, 3.2, 3.8. I think 4 is a reasonable assumption. It's definitely not an impossible number. So this is streams per listener is going to be a 4. So now what that means, this is we can actually get monthly listeners required. All we have to do is get this and divide it by that. Convert this puppy into a number so it has commas. 400,000 monthly listeners. And that's how I get the answer at the beginning of this video. And I realize that might sound silly because what is a good number? But I think the answer is yes. 400,000 monthly listeners is a nice result. And what I mean by that is it doesn't sound completely impossible, right? 400,000 isn't some crazy big number that you can't comprehend. If it was like 2 million, right? It's like in our brains, we can't necessarily always comprehend how many people that actually is. 400,000 is a ton of people, but it's not like superstar level. And that, I think, is the best part about this result. So if you want to learn how you can promote your music and grow your monthly listeners on Spotify and other streaming platforms, check out this video right here where I walk through the entire process from start to finish. And if you want to see whatever YouTube thinks you should watch, check out this video right here. Anyways, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next video. Bye.